I'm pulling up. I don't have an attendee yet.
Should we wait for the attendee or should we get started?
We are recording, so let's get started.
Someone did just come in.
There, Councilor Thompson just came in. So Tracy, let's go ahead and start the presentation.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. Today, we are here to discuss the ABCA, or the analysis of Brownfield's cleanup alternatives for the former Corcoran Building. The city was recently awarded an EPA Brownfield's cleanup grant in the amount of $250,000 to perform remediation mainly of petroleum contaminated waste and asbestos containing materials within the building. So here's
The three of us should probably introduce ourselves. I'm sorry.
oh, my apologies, Rob.
So I'm Rob May. I'm Director of Planning and Economic Development for the City of Brockton. Tracy?
Hi, I'm Tracy Costa. I'm an LSP with ES&M, and we are the Qualified Environmental Professional, the QEP, that's been awarded to perform this work, to perform the management of the cleanup.
John, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, I am John Fay, and I am the Senior Planner for the City of Brockton.
And we are joined this evening by Councilor Jeffrey Thompson. I have unmuted or allowed his microphone to be active, so Councilor Thompson can join in with questions at any time that he wants. He just has to unmute his microphone.
Great. I appreciate that, Rob. Jeff Thompson, Brockton's Ward 5 City Councilor. The Corcoran Building is in my ward. So looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. So if you're familiar with the Corcoran Supply Company building, it is located along the eastern side of Montello Street at 308 Montello Street and referred to as parcel 135074. It's abutted to the east by the MBTA commuter rail corridor, to the north by two city-owned parking lots. Also across the street to the west, there's another parking lot that was associated with the Corcoran Supply Company, and commercial development to the south. The building is located in an area of mixed use, residential and commercial use. So the overall property is a little over 0.7 acres. This building, as you see, it was formerly constructed in 1915 as a three-story warehouse, initially occupied by a wholesale grocer, and subsequently by Corcoran Supply Company, which was a plumbing supply company for about 50 years, from the 30s to about 1980. And the city took it as a tax taking back in 1996. So the city's been very proactive over the last 10 years to try to get its arms around any suspect contamination at the property. And that included performing 3 phase 1 environmental site assessments. It's really looking at background documentation and data to understand what the past history of the property was, and if there were any recognized environmental conditions. Because there were some recognized environmental conditions, or RECs, a phase 2 environmental site assessment was performed in 2003. That really consisted of some limited soil and groundwater investigation, along with 2 geophysical surveys. And the purpose of those surveys was really to evaluate the potential presence of any what we call underground anomalies, such as underground storage tanks. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. And then also hazardous building material surveys, both in 2011 and 2021. And really all of these details from the phase one all the way through the phase two and the additional assessment activities, that really supported the successful EPA Brownfields cleanup grant application. So even though we're not talking about the mass development Brownfields cleanup grant, that's another $250,000 that was awarded to the city. And that a portion of that grant, the portion of the mass development grant, will really satisfy the 20% cost share, EPA's 20% cost share, which is, so it's really a win-win for the city. So in terms of the assessment findings, there was this, not surprisingly, asbestos containing materials, mainly in roof materials and in areas of the building, including piping and also some of the furnaces. Also, there were a number of underground and one above ground storage tank that were discovered. And that was based upon some limited fire department records, but also based on the results of these geophysical surveys.
For the audience, the geophysical survey can also include things like ground penetrating radar, which
Exactly.
show anomalies underground. It just so it doesn't look like the rest of the area. And from that, they're able to deduce presence of metals and tanks.
Absolutely, Rob. That's quite accurate. And we'll be showing you a little bit more details regarding the results of the geophysical surveys. This may be a little hard to discern, but this is a bird's eye view of the property. So you can see the building. And again, as I had described earlier, to the east, you can see the MBTA commuter rail corridor. And then also you can see barely see, there's a lot of vegetation, but to the north, parking lots. And similarly to the west across the street, that was another parking lot, I believe is owned by the city. That was part of the Corcoran Building. So along the northern portion of the building is what we refer to as the vaulted above ground storage tank. So if you can understand, imagine it's an above ground storage tank that contains fuel oil that was used to heat the building. So it connects to a furnace. However, the tank is vaulted with concrete block and cement, and also covered with sand. So it's really hard to assess whether or not there's been any leaking or contamination associated with that above ground storage tank. The capacity of that tank is approximately 800 gallons. And we'll show you a little more details concerning the other underground storage tanks at the site. There's one inside of a courtyard that's about 500 to 1,000 gallons. There are also two suspect underground storage tanks in the garage that measure approximately 1,000 gallons each in capacity, and also another 1,000 gallon underground storage tank. Based on historic records, the tank was installed back in the 1930s and contained gasoline. So that's pretty an interesting discovery. So this is a better bird's eye view. And actually, this is a drone photograph that was taken by the company that performed the geophysical survey. And we're going to talk a little bit about what I refer to as the inaccessible rooms. So as you look at this photograph, to the bottom right, you will see an area that's shaded sort of as pink. And that room appears to be an old office, but boy, oh boy, that is an interesting room in that if you look at the line that goes from that pink room, that office room, over to the right, we were able to trace from the basement boiler to that room piping, which suggests that there may be at least one fuel oil tank that connected to the boiler and is within the footprint of that room. However, that pipe could also extend to these two tanks that are referred to as A3 and A4. But beyond that, if you now look below that inaccessible room toward the sidewalk, we were able to trace another pipe, which seems to have been used for the gasoline connection to that room. So at the end of the day, there is a likelihood that there is also a tank within this room. Based on the old fire department records, it does show, it's just a rudimentary drawing that shows a 1,000 gallon UST that was installed around 1930. So we have, yes.
I was just gonna say, we call it the inaccessible room because the roof has collapsed and there is building debris that may include asbestos and other hazardous building materials. And so it's very difficult to operate in that room without releasing more asbestos into the atmosphere. So we haven't been able to get into it, which is why we call it the inaccessible room.
Yes, and we do have some photos to show you of that inaccessible room. And believe it or not, the roof has really decayed a little bit more. This roof was in much better, actually in better condition when this photograph was taken. And when you see the photographs of the room, you'll understand what we're talking about. So again, what this photo is showing is, we have, again, in this accessible room, 1 to 2 suspect underground storage tanks. We're assuming at least one. You'll see this area that's referred to as A2. That was just a metal anomaly, no tank. A2, A3 and A4, those appear to be 2 suspect 1,000 gallon underground storage tanks. And over to the left, this area we're referring to as A1. This is a courtyard. There's another tank, approximately 500 gallons in capacity. So again, that's the benefit of really performing these geophysical surveys. Again, as Rob described with the ground penetrating radar. So when you prepare an ABCA, you've really got to evaluate what your cleanup alternatives can be, from really doing very little to doing as much as you can in terms of what's feasible from a cost perspective, feasible from being able to implement the technology. So really for us, we evaluated 3 cleanup alternatives. One, really doing nothing, no remedial action. So no removal of tanks, no removal of asbestos to be able to access those tanks, and just really monitoring groundwater to evaluate whether or not those tanks are leaking. I mean, certainly that's an easy thing to do. There is a cost associated with it, however, and that can actually be up to $50,000 if you can imagine you're monitoring groundwater for 10, 20 plus years. So really that for us wasn't really a feasible option, and really wouldn't be a feasible option for any developers that might be interested in developing the site.
Right, there's no economic activity on the site because there hasn't been remediation, there hasn't been a cleanup.
That's a very good point, Rob. So again, I mean, the benefit of this cleanup grant is be able to remediate these contaminant sources and move this site forward and attract those developers. The second option is the option we'll talk more about, because that's really the option we selected. It's called these XC2 technologies. So removing tanks or keeping them sort of in place, closure in place. And we'll talk about why some of these tanks we may not be able to remove them, and we might need to close them in place. Also, excavation of contaminated soil, abatement of asbestos, that limited abatement just to be able to accommodate the tank removals and the soil excavation, and then really monitoring the groundwater. There are 3 older wells that were installed in 2011, but installing some monitoring wells just to really ensure that there are no contaminant impacts to groundwater. And lastly, another option would be, it's a little different from number 1 in that, aside from not really doing anything in terms of actively remediating the site, you could implement a deed restriction, or what's called an activity and use limitation. So in other words, make it clear that there are limitations on the type of activities that could be performed on the site because of the presence of a contaminant source. But really, that would be an option if it was infeasible to really do anything. So in terms of, again, so as I conveyed earlier, for number one, that option, the cost of that would range from about $50,000 to $75,000. Alternative two, approximately $250,000. Alternative three ranges from $75,000 to $100,000. So again, we did select number two. Again, the grant is providing this as a feasible option. And it does mitigate any risk to any potential future receptors and occupants of the building. So really, the cleanup approach, again, the plan is to really perform all these activities to get this site back on the tax rolls, really to align it with the city's vision for redevelopment, and also to achieve regulatory compliance under the Massachusetts contingency plan. So really for us, because we've got some structural engineering concerns. I mean, this is an older building. Some of these tanks are really close to foundations. There are load-bearing walls. So it's really for us bringing on a structural engineer to really understand what we can and cannot do, really which activities are feasible. And really a lot of that is in terms of removal of some of the roofing materials, again, understanding whether or not some of these tanks need to be closed in place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, so in terms of the actual cleanup, so the city, even though we are the qualified environmental professional, the city is going to bid out the actual cleanup work. So we are preparing bid specifications so that the cleanup activities can be publicly bid. So our intent is to have our bid ready by the end of September, so that way we can work with the city to publicly bid this by the end of September, because we really want to try to do this work this fall. Again, the plan is we will need to remove portions of the roof that have this hanging asbestos debris and then temporarily cover it. So in case some of the work is delayed a bit in terms of contractor award or just the contractor schedule, we can do the work even if we've got to do some of it, if some of it lingers on toward the beginning of the year.
Mhm.
So in terms of the asbestos abatement, we'll talk a little bit more about those details in the upcoming slides. But again, even though there's asbestos in other parts of the building, our focus is to only abate the asbestos that's really in our way. So that's roofing materials. So roofing materials above the inaccessible room, and it's roofing materials that are damaged. And there's an area in the garage. It's sort of like this L-shaped area that the roofing materials will need to be removed. And really all of that material is managed as bulk asbestos waste. And beyond, and I'll show you an upcoming photo. In addition to that, believe it or not, we did find bags of asbestos in that inaccessible room. So it's quite an interesting room. So once that inaccessible room is abated and cleaned up, we want to go back in and do a geophysical survey just so we can verify, is there only that one tank in that room, or are there two tanks? So that'll help us just so we have a good understanding before we open up that floor. And again, the plan, best case scenario is that we can remove the tanks, but if some of these tanks, if the structural engineer determines that the tanks can't be removed, we'll need to close those tanks in place. So what that means is opening up the tanks, removing all of the waste inside the tanks, what we refer to as containerized waste. That would be liquid petroleum, any sludge, and if we can excavate any soils in the surrounding area. But again, our main objective is to remove the tanks and only close in place if we can't remove them. The good thing is, based on the limited phase 2 assessment activities that were performed in 2011, there doesn't appear to be what's called a release condition. It doesn't appear that those tanks have leaked yet, but because those are likely steel tanks that are rusted and they're really not compliant tanks, it's only a matter of time that they do start leaking. And as I had conveyed earlier, we will perform what's called this post-remediation groundwater monitoring. And that would be installing some new monitoring wells around those tanks to ensure that there's no contamination to groundwater. Because really for us, we want to make sure that there are no impacts or what's called vapor intrusions. So we can look at the groundwater and we can look at the concentrations and compare them to a certain standard to determine if there could be accumulation of petroleum vapors in the building in the future. So that's really another benefit.
Or adjacent buildings.
Or adjacent buildings, you're absolutely correct. So as I had conveyed earlier, if you take a look at these tanks, you'll see, so this small one, this one in the courtyard, if you can barely see, that's A1. That's really, really close to the foundation of the building. Similarly, two of the 1,000 gallon tanks, USTs that I mentioned earlier that are also outside of the inaccessible room, those also are pretty close to the foundation. So really the plan will be once we uncover, or I should say the cleanup contractor uncovers these floors, it will be to really look at those tanks to determine whether or not they can be removed. The other thing is in our specs, we're going to ensure that that concrete is not jackhammered, because again, this is a conversation we've already had with the structural engineer. We don't want a lot of vibration happening. It's an older building. Again, the concerns are, our structural concerns. If you can sort of see a little bit of this inaccessible room, we're looking out toward Montello Street. And again, so this wall you're looking at is a load bearing wall. So we cannot remove that wall. There is on the other side, this sliding door. So if you look at that top photo on the top right, you can see a little bit of that door that will actually slide open. That gets us inside the inaccessible room from the other side of the garage. Family photos. Here's the inaccessible room. So there are two photos here. If you look at the left photo, you can now see that damage, the roof damage. You can see a little bit of cave in. You can see that there were some attempts over time by the city to try to repair the roof. But really that whole section of roof will need to come down before we can do any work safely within that inaccessible room. And if you look over to the right, you'll see some of that abandoned debris, including bags of asbestos that are within that room. So do keep in mind, part of the bidding process will include a bid walk, so that and it will be a mandatory bid walk, because really any cleanup contractor that's going to respond to bids really needs to get a good understanding of really the lay of the land inside this building. So Rob talked a little bit about the geophysical survey. So here's a glance of some of the type of equipment that's used to perform that those geophysical surveys, the ground penetrating radar. And if you look to the top left, you'll see what an underground storage tank would really be represented as. So you look at that middle section, you can sort of see this graphical representation, and then you see more of a picture to the left. So again, that will help us once we get back into that inaccessible room, or I should say get into it. We haven't been able to do so. That will help us to really get our arms around what's under that room. It's just really interesting. So again, we talked a little bit again about the tank removals or closure in place. I mean, certainly these tanks that are in the pictures are much larger than what we would encounter. But again, as you get closer to any building structures, you just have to be really careful.
And certainly a tank that is steel, that has rusted and that is, could rupture.
Absolutely.
Or something that is next to or actually under a foundation, we wouldn't want to remove. And therefore the closure in place would be an option there.
Absolutely, absolutely. But certainly, it still is an opportunity to remove the containerized waste and that threat, what we refer to as a threat of release. So, I mean, it's certainly not always as effective as being able to remove the tank and get under it. But you can actually, in some cases, drill through that bottom of that tank too. So that would likely be backfilled with sand or a slurry. But most likely, and that's another conversation we will have with our structural engineer to evaluate what makes more sense, sand or slurry from a structural standpoint. And here's some photos of really what groundwater monitoring looks like. Again, it's we use an EPA low flow sampling technique. We install wells. The good thing is it's pretty easy to get into that garage to install the wells. One thing I did not mention is that above ground storage tank that feeds another boiler in the building. That one is located in a basement area, and it is going to be very challenging for accessibility. So that's why the bid walk will be very, very important. Again, just so that the bidders understand that there are some challenges to removing that above ground storage tank in that basement.
Tracy, I want to touch base on this post remediation groundwater monitoring. How often does the LSP take samples, and how does that get conveyed? How does that information get conveyed to the city and or DEP?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, there's not a reporting condition. So the city did perform assessment back in 2011, and that included the collection of soil and groundwater samples. And those sampling results are compared to what we refer to as standards. So Mass DEP, very specific standards that we compare to for soil and groundwater. And if you exceed these standards, then you have to now report to DEP. They're based on historical groundwater sampling results. There was no evidence of contaminant impacts. But again, that was 2011. I want to just go back a little bit and talk about another potential for a reporting condition. It's dependent upon when we're doing what's called our field screening, where we screen the organic vapors using a device called a PID, or a photo ionization detector. And if we actually see concentrations of at least 100 parts per million within the area, the outside wall of an underground storage tank, that's now becomes reportable, and you're now in DEP's system. And we have certain reporting requirements. So based upon the results of what we see during the soil sampling, during the tank removals, we will then be able to determine, gosh, is the groundwater contaminated? If we determine the groundwater is not contaminated, we may only need to do 1 or 2 sampling events. But as soon as we get those results and we tabulate these results, we will get those to the city immediately and have the conversation. I mean, certainly for us, it's throughout the remediation process. It's constant conversations, discussions, meetings with the city. Again, because at any time we could trigger this new reporting condition. What I didn't really discuss too much in terms of the best case scenario when we remove an underground storage tank. So the tank is opened up, it's what's called inerted, the gases are removed. All the waste, what we refer to as containerized waste, liquids, sludge, etc., are removed. The tank is then removed, and that tank is cleaned out and that can just be managed as scrap metal. Then we will excavate any soils that are contaminated, and that's again based on the field screening, visual olfactory cues.
Mhm.
Those soils will be temporarily, we put them in what's called a stockpile. We sample those soils, and those will be managed as remediation waste. And those, we have to sample those for very specific, what we refer to as disposal characterization criteria. So a facility, different facilities have specific criteria. The good thing is though, there's at least one facility left in the state that does accept petroleum waste for recycling. So from EPA's perspective, that is kind of more of a green option. So certainly that would be, and I've worked with that facility recently on another petroleum release. So we would stockpile those soils temporarily, either in the building or in the parking lots. And those are lined and covered with poly sheeting. And we would manage those offsite as soon as possible. So I had mentioned the various reporting requirements, both for EPA and Mass DEP. So before we do anything, we prepare a health and safety plan, and we share that health and safety plan with our contractors. We'll review the cleanup contractor's health and safety plan, because again, there are so many moving parts. The health and safety of everyone, including not only the personnel at the site, but the surrounding community is really important. You know, if we determine that we need to close off the sidewalk, for example, we'll have a police detail, because again, it's also partially a residential neighborhood across the street and to the southwest. If there is a reporting condition, we will submit either an immediate response action, an IRA, or release abatement measure plan, and various status reports and completion reports to Mass DEP. And we coordinate that effort with the city. So the LSP coordinates that effort so I would coordinate that with Rob, and we would submit those reports electronically to Mass DEP. The fire department will require what's called a tank closure report. That can be in the form of either this IRA completion report or RAM status report, or it can be a standalone report if, for example, there is not a reporting condition. In terms of EPA reporting, we will be preparing a community relations plan to really talk about community engagement, community outreach associated with the cleanup. So we are in the midst of the 30-day public review period of this ABCA. So once we receive any comments, we will then finalize the ABCA. Before we can do any sampling, we need to prepare what's called a QAP. It's a quality assurance project plan. So we really outline the type of sampling we're going to be performing, like I had mentioned to you before, in terms of sampling soil and groundwater, and also disposal characteristics. That QAP is reviewed by EPA. It's usually a 30-day review period. So I will be providing that to the city for its review within the next couple of weeks. So there's also a Section 106 review to evaluate if this cleanup is going to have an impact on any historic structures. So it's my understanding that this building, even though it's considered historic, it's not on the Mass Historic Commission inventory. Correct, Rob?
Correct. It is not listed.
It's not listed. Okay,
It's inventoried, but
Thank
it's
you.
not listed.
Thank you for correcting me on that. So on a quarterly basis, we report to EPA really what's going on in terms of the budget and all of the activities. So that's done on a quarterly basis. And I work with Rob to submit those reports to EPA.
That's the acres reporting you see.
That is
there.
the acres reporting, correct. So any waste, any remediation waste, so any of this waste that is accumulated during the cleanup will be managed under bill of lading or a waste manifest. I will utilize the bill of lading, as the LSP for the majority of the waste. Sometimes the waste manifest could be used for, again, the containerized waste potentially, or just the scrap metal. And the other piece is any receiving facility that is going to be receiving the soil. I need to provide an LSP opinion to really discuss the history of the site and really the results of any sampling we've done of the waste, and to really demonstrate to the facility that this would meet their acceptance criteria. So at the end of the day, once we remediated everything, if this is indeed becomes this mass DEP or a disposal site, we should achieve what's called a permanent solution and submit a permanent solution statement to mass DEP. Now, keep in mind, all of these reports that are listed here will need to be really saved by the city as a repository, both electronically and hard copy, so it is accessible to the public.
Correct.
Yeah. Any questions?
So if any members of the public would like to ask questions, this is the time. If you're in attendee mode, if you use the raise your hand icon at the bottom of the screen, that will identify you as wanting to ask a question. And of course, Councilor Thompson has been moved into a permitting commenting position. So if he has questions also, he just needs to unmute his mic.
Sure. Again, good evening. Tracy, that really great presentation is really comprehensive. Got a much better understanding of what we know is on the site as of right now, and what we're doing to move forward. So you stated that there was an expectation or a desire to have the RFP out in late September. What steps are done between now and then? You said that there's a 30-day public input process, and that this public meeting is the beginning of that process. So what do we have to do between now and getting this RFP out? Once the RFP is out, is there an expected time frame in which this work can be completed?
Yes, so let me answer your questions. So I believe the 30-day public review period for the ABCA started earlier. And Rob, could you provide the date that the public notice was issued?
It was exactly 2 weeks from today.
So that's great.
2 weeks ago.
Perfect. So we're already 2 weeks into the ABCA. So again, we will finalize it after that 30 days, so 2 weeks from now. So there's really nothing holding us up beyond that. So I will, again, the QAP's not even though there's a 30-day EPA review period, that's really not going to hold things up, because we don't intend to be sampling within the next month or so. So we are preparing the bid specifications as we speak. And once we have those bid specifications finalized, we will have the city perform a final review, and then we will work with the city to advertise the bid package publicly. I believe that would be most likely through the Central Register and through any other maybe public newspapers. And then, so again, we do need to provide adequate time for responses. So I would hope within 2 weeks from publication of the bid specs, we want to schedule the bid walk, because again, we want to make sure that the cleanup contractors, the prospective cleanup contractors, have enough time to review the bid package. Certainly, there are going to be questions that will come up during the site walk, and maybe even beforehand. So what we will do is after we receive all the questions, after the bid walk, we will then provide a response, and that might be a bid addendum. So now let's say we're now into October. My hope is that by the end of October, early November, the city's in a position to award the lowest qualified bidder.
And then Tracy, the estimated time of performing the cleanup?
Yeah, so again, we really want to have the asbestos abated from the roof, you can imagine, because the concern is winter and snow and ice. So the plan would be, hopefully, just in terms of the schedule, would be to now just focus initially on abating that roof. So the thing is too, the contractor has to, let me just step back a bit. We would be preparing a non-traditional work plan that has to go to DEP for the asbestos abatement. And there's a little bit of there's a review by DEP to do that. It's usually, I understand, within a couple of weeks. But again, we need to definitely get that roof taken care of and then really buttoned up so we can then work inside that building.
And then lastly, let's say everything goes according to plan. We're able to get in there and abate all of the issues. At that point, when we have a permanent solution statement, would this building, and it's an environmental status, it's able to then be used for any use the city desires, or is it because it had this level of contamination, are certain uses permanently restricted, or would this abatement kind of wipe the slate clean and now it could be used for any purpose?
So do keep in mind, the MCP does not cover asbestos. Asbestos is its own separate issue. And again, we're not abating all the asbestos in the building. So there will continue to be asbestos in other portions of the building. So really for us, is part of the permanent solution is assessing risk. And we assess risk, when we look at the data, we look at the soil data, the groundwater data, we look at risk, we look in terms of, again, have we left any contamination behind? And that's why we collect so many samples. Hopefully we're in a position where there's a permanent solution statement without any restrictions at all, or what we refer to as no conditions. Because if there were conditions, that gets back to that activity and use limitation, or that AUL. I am hopeful that we will attain a permanent solution statement without conditions. Best case scenario is that there is no release condition. I mean, the best case scenario would be, oh my gosh, we open up these tanks, the ground, they haven't leaked. But again, it's usually highly unlikely. But petroleum, it's very different as compared to something like chlorinated solvents that really require much more aggressive remedial approaches. The other thing I did not mention is one good thing we have on our side is the depth to groundwater. So back in 2011, the depth to groundwater ranged from about 11 feet below ground surface to about 14. So we don't think we're going to encounter groundwater. So in other words, as we're excavating, we're not going to need to pump water out and manage that offsite, which is really beneficial.
Great. And I guess one last question. So we were initially talked about the two grants, both the DEP grant and the EPA grant. You said that there was a cost estimate, maybe about $250,000. And just if, number one, Rob, if you could remind us what the total grant, like what is the grant total from the two grants? And is there an expectation that whatever prospective remediation that's going to occur, we have the proper funding to cover anything that's foreseen and potentially not foreseen.
So Counselor, we have two grants, one from the US EPA in the amount of $250,000 and one from Mass Development in the amount of $250,000. So total of $500,000 to work with. Out of that fund comes the LSP expense, who is designing and monitoring this activity that the abatement contractor will be performing. Then there's the actual abatement work that the contractor will perform. And then we have to transport any of that material to a landfill. And that's all coming out of this fund. But we think that we can cover all of it between these two grants.
Okay. All right. That's essentially the questions I have. Again, Tracy, thank you for your presentation and your work on this matter. Like I said, a very comprehensive. And I know the city's looking forward to getting this matter resolved, and we appreciate your assistance here. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, John.
Thank you. And I do not see anyone else with their hand up icon. So I think it would be safe to end this meeting. And we look forward to getting out there, moving dirt and getting tanks out of the ground, and ultimately getting this property back onto the tax rolls, creating jobs and economic value for the city. So thank you all for participating and attending. And there'll be other updates throughout the year as we advance. So thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.